I signed the papers with a smile on my face. She held my hand, called me her future. 3 months later, I was sitting in a hostel in Manila with 17 pounds in my pocket. The house was gone. The money was gone. And Maria? She'd vanished like smoke. I was sitting across from her in that cafe in Makati when I first thought maybe life wasn't over yet. The place smelled like strong coffee and fresh pastries, and Maria was laughing at something I'd said about Manchester weather. "It rains every day?" she asked, her eyes wide like I'd just told her about another planet. "Every single day?" I smiled. It felt strange on my face. I hadn't smiled much in 2 years. "Not since Margaret died. Not every day," I said. "Just most days. Gray skies, drizzle, the whole bit. You get used to it." She leaned forward, her chin resting on her hand. "I don't think I could ever get used to that. Here, even when it rains, it's warm. The sun comes back." She had this way of listening that made me feel like I was the only person in the world, not just the cafe. The world. I'd been in the Philippines for 3 weeks by then, just wandering around Manila, trying to figure out what retired life was supposed to feel like. I'd sold my flat in Manchester, packed 2 suitcases, and bought a one-way ticket. My daughter Emily had asked me if I was running away. Maybe I was. Maria worked part-time at a travel agency near my hotel. I'd gone in to ask about island tours, and she'd spent an hour showing me brochures, asking questions about where I was from, what I did, why I came alone. My wife passed. I'd told her that first day, 2 years ago. Cancer. She touched my hand, just briefly. "I'm so sorry," she'd said, and I believed her. That was my first mistake, believing her. Now, sitting in that cafe, she was telling me about her own dreams. "I've always wanted to open a small guest house," she said. "Nothing fancy, just somewhere travelers can feel at home. You know, like a real home, not a hotel." "That sounds lovely," I said, and I meant it. She smiled. "You're easy to talk to, Robert. Most men just want to talk about themselves." I laughed. "Well, I'm 67. I've talked about myself enough for one lifetime." "67 isn't old," she said quickly. "My grandfather is 73, and he still works on his farm every day." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just sipped my coffee. She was 28. I knew that because she'd told me during our second meeting. 28, younger than Emily. But she didn't make me feel old. She made me feel seen. We sat there for another hour, talking about everything and nothing. She told me about growing up in Manila, about her parents who ran a small sari-sari store, about her younger brother who wanted to be an engineer. I told her about my years as an electrician, about the jobs I'd worked, the houses I'd wired, the life I'd built with Margaret. "You must miss her," Maria said softly. I nodded. I did, every day. But sitting there with Maria, the ache felt a little less sharp. When we finally stood to leave, she touched my arm. "Can we do this again? Tomorrow, maybe?" "I'd like that," I said. She kissed my cheek before walking away. Just a quick, light kiss, but it stayed with me all night. Lying in my hotel room, staring at the ceiling, I thought maybe this was why I'd come to the Philippines. Not to run away, but to find something, someone. When I closed my eyes that night, I didn't see Margaret's face in the hospital bed. I saw Maria's smile. And for the first time in 2 years, I thought maybe I deserved to be happy again. A week later, we were sitting in a restaurant near the bay, watching the sun set over Manila. The air was thick and warm, and I could hear the water lapping against the pier. Maria had suggested the place, said it was one of her favorites. We'd been seeing each other almost every day since that first cafe meeting. Walks along Roxas Boulevard, dinners in small local restaurants, late-night phone calls where she'd tell me about her day, and I'd listen like every word mattered, because to me, they did. That night, she looked different. Nervous, maybe. She kept fidgeting with her napkin, folding and unfolding it. "You okay?" I asked. She looked up at me and smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I've been thinking about something," she said, and I don't know if I should tell you. You can tell me anything, I said. I meant it. She took a deep breath. I told you about my dream. The guest house. I nodded. You did. It's a beautiful dream. It's more than a dream, she said. I've been saving for years. Every spare peso. But it's never enough. Property here is expensive, and I'm just a clerk at a travel agency. I make maybe 15,000 pesos a month. That's like 200 pounds. Her eyes were wet now, and I felt something twist in my chest. I'm not asking you for anything, she said quickly. I just wanted to tell someone who'd understand, someone who knows what it's like to build something. I reached across the table and took her hand. How much do you need? She blinked. What? For the guest house. How much would it take? She shook her head. Robert, no. I wasn't trying to. I know, I said. But I'm asking. How much? She hesitated. I could see her thinking, weighing something in her mind. Finally, she said, There's a property in Batangas, near the beach. It's not finished, but it has good bones. My cousin Lito is a real estate agent. He told me about it. The asking price is around 4 million pesos, maybe 4.5. I did the math in my head. Roughly 55 to 60,000 pounds. I'd sold my Manchester flat for 130,000. After paying off the mortgage and setting aside money for living expenses, I had about 80,000 left. That's not impossible, I said. Her eyes went wide. Robert, I can't let you. What if we did it together? I said. The words came out before I'd even thought them through. But once I said them, they felt right. What if we made this a partnership? You run it, I help fund it. We build something together. She stared at me. For a long moment she didn't say anything. Then she whispered, Do you mean that? I do, I said. And I did. I'd been thinking about what my life would look like here, wandering around Manila alone, living in hotels, eating meals by myself. But this was something real, something purposeful. We could make it beautiful, she said, her voice picking up energy. 3 or 4 rooms for guests, a small restaurant maybe, somewhere quiet where people come to relax. We'd run it together. Together, I repeated. She squeezed my hand. You're different from other men, Robert. You actually care. I smiled. I'm old enough to know what matters. She laughed, and the nervousness from earlier was gone. We spent the rest of dinner talking about the property, about what it could become, about the life we could build. When we left the restaurant, she took my arm and leaned her head against my shoulder. Thank you, she whispered, for believing in me. I kissed the top of her head. Thank you for giving me something to believe in. That night, lying in bed, I thought about Margaret. She would have liked Maria. She would have wanted me to be happy, and I was. For the first time in 2 years, I was excited about waking up the next morning. 3 weeks later, Maria and I took a bus to Batangas. It was a 3-hour ride, the kind where the air conditioning barely worked and the roads were rough enough to rattle your bones. But Maria held my hand the whole way, pointing out little towns and mountains, telling me stories about places she'd visited as a child. When we finally arrived, Lito was waiting for us outside a small convenience store. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 30s, with slicked back hair and a bright smile. Kuya Robert, he said, shaking my hand firmly. Maria has told me so much about you. All good things, I hope, I said. He laughed. Only the best. Come, the property is just 10 minutes away. We piled into his car, a dusty white sedan that smelled faintly of cigarettes. As we drove, Lito talked nonstop. About the area, about property values, about how Batangas was becoming a hotspot for tourism. More and more foreigners are buying here. He said, It's a smart investment. In 5 years, this area will be worth double. I glanced at Maria. She was looking out the window, her face calm and content. When we turned onto a narrow road lined with palm trees, I felt my heart start to race. The property came into view slowly, a 2-story house, white with blue trim, sitting on a small hill overlooking the ocean. It was half finished, with scaffolding on one side and exposed concrete in places, but even incomplete, it was beautiful. "Here we are," Lito said, pulling up to the front. We got out, and I just stood there for a moment, taking it in. The ocean was maybe 200 meters away, sparkling under the afternoon sun. The air smelled like salt and fresh paint. "Come inside," Maria said, tugging my hand. The interior was bare but spacious, concrete floors, empty rooms, high ceilings. Lito walked us through, pointing out where the kitchen would go, where the guest rooms were, where we could add a balcony. "The owner started building it 3 years ago," he explained. "Then he ran out of money. He's desperate to sell. That's why the price is so good." "How much again?" I asked. 4.2 million pesos, Lito said. "That's about 57,000 pounds. I nodded slowly. It was more than I'd planned to spend. But standing there, looking at Maria's face as she ran her hand along the wall, I could see it, the guest house, the life we'd build. "What do you think?" she asked, her eyes hopeful. "I think it's perfect," I said. She broke into a smile and wrapped her arms around me. "We could make this so beautiful, Robert. I can already see it." Lito cleared his throat. "There's one thing you should know, Kuya Robert. Foreigners can't own land in the Philippines. It's a legal thing, but what most couples do is put the property in the Filipina partner's name. It's very common, totally normal." I felt a small tug of hesitation. "And I'd be protected somehow?" Lito nodded. "Absolutely. We'll draw up a lease agreement. You'll have legal rights. And besides," he glanced at Maria and smiled, "you're partners, right? You trust each other." Maria took my hand and squeezed it. "I'd never do anything to hurt you, Robert. You know that." I looked at her warm eyes, her gentle smile, the way she looked at me like I mattered. "I know," I said. And I did. I trusted her completely. We shook hands with Lito outside the property, the sun setting behind us, casting everything in gold. "I'll start drawing up the papers," Lito said. "We can have everything ready in 2 weeks." On the bus ride back to Manila, Maria rested her head on my shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered, "for making my dream come true." I kissed her forehead. "Our dream," I said. She smiled. "Our dream." I stared out the window at the passing countryside, at the small houses and rice fields and endless sky. I felt lighter than I had in years, like I was finally building something again, like my life had purpose. I didn't see the cliff I was walking toward. I didn't see it at all. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in a lawyer's office in Manila. The room was small and stuffy, with a single ceiling fan that spun lazily overhead. Attorney Ramos sat behind a desk piled high with folders and papers, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. Maria sat beside me, her hand resting on my knee. Lito was there too, leaning against the wall, relaxed and casual. The documents were spread out in front of me, thick stacks of paper, some in English, some in Tagalog, filled with legal language I could barely understand. "This is the deed of sale," Attorney Ramos said, tapping one of the pages. "It transfers ownership of the property from the current owner to Miss Maria Santos." I glanced at Maria. She smiled at me. "And this," he continued, sliding another document forward, "is the lease agreement. It grants you, Mr. Robert Hayes, the right to occupy and use the property for a period of 25 years. 25 years, I repeated. "That's a long time." "It's standard," Lito said from behind me. "Renewable too, if you want." I picked up the lease agreement and tried to read through it. My eyes scanned the words, but nothing stuck. It was all legal jargon, clauses and subclauses. "Can I have a copy to review?" I asked. "Of course," Attorney Ramos said. "But the seller is eager to close. If we don't finalize this week, he may accept another offer." I felt a flicker of panic. "Another offer?" I looked at Maria. "What do you think?" She leaned closer, her voice soft. "I think we've come this far, Robert. We've seen the property. We've talked about our plans. Lito has been working so hard to make this happen. She paused. But if you're not ready, we can wait. There was something in her tone. Not pressure, exactly, but a kind of gentle disappointment, like I was letting her down. No, I said. No, I want to do this. Are you sure? She asked. I nodded. I'm sure. Attorney Ramos slid a pen across the desk. Sign here, here, and here, he said, pointing. I picked up the pen. My hand hovered over the first line. And the property will be in Maria's name? I asked. Correct, Lito said. It's the only way legally. But you'll be protected under the lease. And what if something happens? I asked. What if we separate or something changes? Maria's hand tightened on my knee. Robert, she said quietly, do you not trust me? I looked at her. Her eyes were hurt, confused. Of course I trust you, I said quickly. I'm just trying to understand how this works. It works because we're partners, she said, because we're building this together. If you don't believe in us, then maybe we shouldn't. No, I interrupted. I believe in us, I do. Attorney Ramos cleared his throat. Mr. Hayes, I understand this is a significant decision, but I can assure you, this arrangement is very common. Thousands of foreign nationals enter into similar agreements every year. I took a breath. Then I signed the first line. Then the second. Then the third. Maria kissed my cheek. Thank you, she whispered. You won't regret this. Over the next 3 days, I transferred the money. £55,000, split across 3 transactions to avoid triggering bank alerts. Each time I hit confirm on my phone, I felt a small jolt of anxiety. But then Maria would kiss me, or Lito would text me updates, and the anxiety would fade. On the 3rd day, when the final transfer cleared, Maria threw her arms around me. It's ours, she said, her voice thick with emotion. We did it. I held her tight. We did. That night, lying in bed in our rented apartment, I stared at the ceiling. Maria was asleep beside me, her breathing soft and even. I should have felt happy, excited, but instead there was a knot in my stomach, a small, tight knot that I couldn't explain. I told myself it was just nerves. Big decisions always felt like this. I turned over and closed my eyes, forcing myself to sleep. Everything was fine. We were building a future. There was nothing to worry about. Nothing at all. The renovations started 2 weeks after we signed the papers. Or at least, that's what Maria told me. I hadn't seen the property since the day Lito showed it to us. Every time I suggested we drive down to Batangas to check on progress, Maria had a reason why we shouldn't. The contractors aren't ready yet, she'd say. Or, the roads are flooded from the rain. Or, it's not safe with all the construction equipment. At first, I didn't mind. Maria was handling everything. Coordinating with the workers, ordering materials, dealing with the permits. She was on her phone constantly, sending messages, making calls, showing me photos of tiles and paint samples. What do you think of this blue for the guest rooms? She'd ask, holding up her phone. Or this cream color? I'd give my opinion, and she'd nod thoughtfully, making notes. But as the weeks passed, I started to notice things. Small things. Maria was different, not dramatically, just subtly. She was distracted more often, staring at her phone even when we were having dinner. She'd get irritated if I asked too many questions. One evening, I asked, "When can we go see the property?" "I'd love to see how it's coming along," she sighed. "Robert, I told you, the workers are still doing the foundation repairs. There's dust and noise everywhere. It's not worth the trip yet." "I don't mind dust and noise," I said. "I worked construction for 40 years. Her jaw tightened. "Can you just trust me to handle this? You're the investor, I'm the manager. That's how we agreed to do this." I backed off. "Okay, I'm sorry. I just want to be involved." She softened a little. "I know. And you will be. Once it's ready. I want you to see it when it's beautiful, not when it's a mess." That made sense. I told myself it made sense. Then the money request started. The contractors need £8,000 for materials, Maria said one afternoon. Tiles, plumbing, electrical. It's a bit more than we budgeted, but they found termite damage in some of the beams. We have to replace them. £8,000. I hesitated. That seems like a lot. It's a house, Robert, she said. Her tone was sharp. Houses cost money. If you don't want to invest properly, then no, I said quickly. I'll send it. Just send me the invoice. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she smiled. Thank you. I promise it'll be worth it. I transferred the money that night. 2 weeks later, she needed another $5,000. Permit issues, she explained. The local government is being difficult. Lido says we need to pay extra fees to push it through. Is that legal? I asked. She laughed. This is the Philippines, Robert. Everything requires extra fees. That's just how it works here. I sent the money, then another $3,000 for furniture, then another $2,000 for kitchen appliances. Each time, I'd ask to see receipts or photos of the progress. Maria would show me her phone, scrolling quickly through images. Piles of tiles, stacks of wood, workers in hard hats, but the images were blurry, distant. I couldn't see details. One night, I was lying in bed and Maria was in the bathroom. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Without thinking, I glanced at it. A message from someone named Babe with a heart emoji. Miss you. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. I stared at the screen until it went dark. When Maria came back, I asked, Who's Babe? She froze for a second. Then she laughed. That's my cousin, my younger cousin. We call him Babe because he's the baby of the family. Your cousin texts you with heart emojis? I asked. Her face hardened. Robert, are you seriously going through my phone now? I wasn't going through it. It was just sitting there. So you're spying on me? I shook my head. No, this is exactly why I didn't want to do this, she snapped. You don't trust me. You never have. That's not true, I said. Maria, I've given you everything. And I've been working myself to death for our dream, she shot back, while you sit here questioning me. She grabbed her phone and stormed into the other room. I sat there, my chest tight. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe the stress of the renovations was getting to both of us. The next morning, she apologized. I'm sorry, she said, taking my hand. I've just been so stressed. The contractors, the permits, everything. I didn't mean to snap at you. It's okay, I said. I'm sorry too. She kissed me softly. We're almost done. Just a few more weeks and it'll be ready. Then we can finally start our life there. I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her. But the knot in my stomach was tighter now, and it wasn't going away. I woke up alone. The bed beside me was cold, empty. I checked the time on my phone, 8:30 in the morning. Maria's side of the closet was open, her clothes still hanging there. Her toothbrush was still in the bathroom. She was probably just out getting breakfast or running errands. I called her phone, straight to voicemail. I texted her, "Where are you?" No response. By noon, I started to panic. I called again, voicemail. I tried Lido's number. The automated message said the number was no longer in service. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hand shaking. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. I grabbed my wallet and keys and took a taxi to the travel agency where Maria worked. The woman at the desk looked at me blankly when I asked for her. Maria Santos? She repeated. No one by that name works here. She's been here for years, I said. Young woman, late 20s, long dark hair. The woman shook her head. I've been here 5 years. There's no Maria. I stumbled back out onto the street. My chest felt tight. I couldn't breathe. I hailed another taxi. Batangas, I said. I'll give you 2,000 pesos if you can get me there fast. The driver nodded and pulled into traffic. The drive felt like it took forever. My mind was racing, spinning through every conversation, every smile, every promise. When we finally arrived, I directed the driver to the property. The house was there, still white with blue trim, still sitting on the hill, but there was a chain and padlock on the gate. I got out and walked up to the fence. A man was watering plants in the front yard. I waved. "Excuse me," I called. "Do you know who owns this property?" The man walked over, wiping his hands on his shirt. "We do," he said. "My wife and I. We bought it 6 months ago." I felt my legs weaken. 6 months? He nodded. "Yeah. From a guy who'd been trying to sell it for years. Got a good deal on it, too." I pulled out my phone and showed him a photo of Maria. "Have you ever seen this woman?" He squinted at the screen, then shook his head. "No, never seen her." I stood there, staring at the house I'd paid for, the house that was supposed to be ours. "Are you okay, sir?" the man asked. I didn't answer. I just walked back to the taxi. "Manila," I said quietly. The driver nodded. On the ride back, I called Maria 17 times. Voicemail, every time. When I got back to the apartment, I knew before I even opened the door. She was gone. Her clothes, her shoes, her toiletries, everything. The drawers were empty. The closet was bare. There was no note. Nothing. I sat down on the floor and pulled out my phone. I called the lawyer's office. The number rang and rang, then disconnected. I tried the number on the contract Lido had given me. Out of service. I opened my banking app. My savings account balance stared back at me. £127. That was it. I'd transferred £68,000 over the past 2 months, and it was all gone. The house was gone. Maria was gone. Everything was gone. I sat there on the floor of that empty apartment until the sun went down and the room went dark. And then I just sat there some more, because I didn't know what else to do. I checked into a hostel in Malate, £20 a night. The room was barely big enough for a single bed, with a shared bathroom down the hall and a window that looked out onto a narrow alley. I lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling. My phone clutched in my hand. I opened my banking app again. £127. I did the math in my head. At £20 a night, I had maybe 6 days before I'd be on the street. My pension wouldn't come through for another 3 weeks. I scrolled through my transaction history. Every transfer I'd made to Maria was there. $55,000 for the property, $8,000 for materials, $5,000 for permits, $3,000 for furniture, $2,000 for appliances. The numbers blurred together. I closed my eyes and tried to replay every conversation we'd had, every smile, every touch, every "I love you." Had any of it been real? Or was I just a walking ATM to her? A foolish old man with too much money and not enough sense? I thought about calling my daughter, Emily. She lived in Manchester with her husband and 2 kids. She'd warned me before I left. "Be careful, Dad," she'd said. "Don't send money to people you don't know." "Maria's not a stranger," I'd told her. "We're building something together." Emily had given me that look. The one that said she didn't believe me but didn't want to argue. Now, lying in this hostel, I couldn't bring myself to call her. The shame was too heavy. She'd been right. I'd been wrong. And I'd lost everything because of it. I spent the next 2 days searching for Maria online. I went through Facebook, Instagram, every social media platform I could think of. Her accounts were gone, deleted. I searched for Lido. Nothing. I tried finding Attorney Ramos. His name brought up a dozen lawyers in Manila, but none that matched the man I'd met. On the 3rd day, I walked into a police station in Ermita. A young officer looked up from his desk. "Can I help you, sir?" "I want to report a scam," I said. He pulled out a form. "What kind of scam?" "Property. Real estate. I transferred £68,000 to someone who said they were buying a house with me. But the house was never mine, and now she's gone." The officer wrote slowly. "Do you have a contract?" I did, but I can't reach the lawyer who notarized it. The numbers are all disconnected. "Do you have receipts, bank statements?" "I have the transfers," I said, But the accounts they went to, I don't know if they're even in her real name. The officer looked up at me. There was pity in his eyes. Sir, how did you meet this person? At a travel agency. And you gave her £68,000? I nodded. He sighed. Sir, I'll file the report. But I have to be honest with you. Cases like this, they're very difficult. If the money went through multiple accounts, if the people involved use fake names, if they've left the country, he trailed off. What are my chances? I asked. He didn't answer right away. Then he said quietly, not good. I walked out of the station and into the bright Manila sun. The streets were crowded with people, jeepneys honking, vendors shouting. Life was going on all around me, but I felt like a ghost. That night, I lay in the hostel bed and thought about Margaret. She'd been smart, practical. She would have seen through Maria in 5 minutes, but Margaret was gone, and I'd been so desperate to fill the emptiness she'd left behind that I'd walked straight into a trap. I pulled up Maria's last known number and typed out a message. I just want to understand. Please, just talk to me. I stared at it for a long time before I hit send. Then I waited. Hours passed. My phone stayed silent. And then, just before midnight, it buzzed. A reply. I'm sorry, Robert. I needed the money. My family was in debt. You have a pension. You'll be okay. I read the message 3 times. My hands were shaking. I typed back. I loved you. I watched the screen. The typing indicator appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again, then nothing. She didn't reply. I set the phone down and sat on the edge of the bed. My hands were still shaking. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad anymore. I was just empty, hollow, like someone had reached inside me and scooped out everything that mattered. The dream was dead, and so was a part of me. 3 days later, I sat in front of a computer at an internet cafe in Ermita, staring at flight comparison websites. I'd borrowed £200 from my credit card to buy a ticket home, Manchester. One way, leaving in 4 days. I'd have just enough left to get a taxi to the airport and maybe eat once before I boarded. I clicked through the options numbly, not really seeing the prices or times. My mind kept drifting back to Maria's last message. You have a pension. You'll be okay. As if £68,000 was nothing. As if 40 years of saving was just pocket money. I bought the ticket and closed the browser. That night, I sat in the hostel room and wrote down everything that had happened. Not for the police, not for Emily, just for myself. I needed to see it all laid out, to understand how I'd been so blind. I met Maria at a travel agency. We had coffee. She listened to my stories. She told me about her dream of a guest house. I offered to help. She introduced me to Lido, her cousin. We saw the property in Batangas. Beautiful house, ocean view, half finished. The owner was desperate to sell. Lido said foreigners can't own land. The property had to be in Maria's name. I signed the papers. I transferred £55,000, then 8,000 more, then 5, then 3, then 2. I never saw the property again. Maria disappeared. The house was never ours. It had been sold 6 months before I even met her. I set down the pen and stared at the words. It was so obvious now. Every red flag I'd ignored, every excuse I'd accepted, every time I'd pushed away doubt because I wanted to believe, because I was lonely, because I was old, because I thought a young, beautiful woman could actually love me. I thought about Margaret. She'd loved me, really loved me. Not because I had money or could fund her dreams, just because I was Robert, the man who made her tea every morning, the man who fixed things around the house, the man who held her hand in the hospital when the cancer finally won. Maria never loved me. She loved what I could give her, and I'd given her everything. On the morning of my flight, I packed my single suitcase and checked out of the hostel. I had £43 left, enough for the taxi and maybe a sandwich at the airport. The hostel owner, an older Filipina woman, looked at me with kind eyes. "Going home?" she asked. I nodded. "Good luck, sir," she said. "Be safe." "Thank you," I said, and I meant it. The taxi ride to the airport felt surreal. I watched Manila pass by through the window, the same streets where I'd walked with Maria, the same restaurants where we'd eaten, the same city where I'd thought I was building a future. At the airport, I checked in and went through security. I sat at the gate, watching families and couples and solo travelers boarding other flights. I wondered if any of them were as lost as I was. When they finally called my flight, I stood and walked to the gate. My legs felt heavy. I wasn't excited to go home. I wasn't relieved. I was just numb. The plane took off, and I watched through the window as the Philippines shrank below me. The islands, the ocean, the cities, it all disappeared into clouds. I closed my eyes. I thought about Maria one last time, her smile, her laugh, the way she'd held my hand and said, "You're different from other men, Robert. You actually care." She was right about one thing. I did care. Too much. And that's what had destroyed me. The flight was long, 14 hours with a layover in Hong Kong. I didn't sleep. I just sat there, staring at the seat in front of me, replaying everything over and over. When we finally landed in Manchester, the sky was gray and drizzling, typical. I stood in the baggage claim area, waiting for my single suitcase to appear on the carousel. My phone buzzed. A message from Emily. "Just landed. I'll meet you outside arrivals." I didn't remember texting her my flight details, but she must have known. She always knew. I found her waiting by the curb, standing beside her car with an umbrella. When she saw me, she didn't ask questions. She just opened her arms. I walked into them and held on. "It's okay, Dad," she whispered. "You're home now." I nodded against her shoulder, but I wasn't sure I believed her. I wasn't sure I'd ever feel home again. Emily's spare room was small but warm. A single bed, a nightstand, a window overlooking the back garden. She'd cleared out her storage boxes to make space for me. "Take your time," she said the first night. "Stay as long as you need." I unpacked my suitcase slowly. 2 weeks' worth of clothes, a few books, my passport. That was it. Everything I owned in the world. My pension came through 3 days after I arrived, £940 a month. After 43 years of paying into it, that's what I got. Enough to cover rent somewhere small, enough to buy food, enough to survive, but barely. I spent the first week in a daze. I'd sit in the living room while Emily's kids watched cartoons, staring at the television without really seeing it. Emily's husband, Paul, was kind. He didn't ask about the Philippines, didn't pry. He'd just offer me tea or ask if I wanted to help him fix something in the garage, small kindnesses. After 2 weeks, Emily sat me down at the kitchen table. "Dad," she said gently, "have you thought about what you're going to do?" I shook my head. "I don't have any money, Em. Nothing saved. I gave it all away." She reached across the table and took my hand. "I'm not asking you to move out. I'm asking what you want to do. Do you want to work? Do you want to stay here? What would make you feel better?" I thought about it. "I need to work," I said finally. "I can't just sit around. I'll go mad." She nodded. "Okay, let's find you something." 2 days later, I had a part-time job at a hardware store in Stretford. £12 an hour, 4 days a week. It was nothing like the work I'd done as an electrician, but it was something. I helped customers find screws and paint and tools. I stocked shelves. I swept the floor at the end of the day. Simple work, mindless work, but it kept me busy. The manager, a younger man named Chris, was patient with me. "You're doing great, Robert," he'd say. "Take your time. You'll get the hang of it." I nodded and kept working. The weeks passed slowly. I moved into a small flat in Salford, a one-bedroom place that cost £500 a month. It was old and drafty, but it was mine. I bought a cheap mattress, a small table, and 2 chairs from a charity shop. I didn't need much. One night, I sat at the table and pulled out a notebook. I started writing everything down again, not for anyone else, just for me. I wrote about Margaret, about the life we'd built together, about the 43 years of waking up beside her, about how much it hurt when she died. I wrote about the loneliness that came after, the empty house, the silent dinners, the nights where I'd lie awake wishing I could just turn back time. I wrote about going to the Philippines, about hoping I could outrun the grief, about meeting Maria, about believing her, about thinking I could have a second chance. And I wrote about the truth, the scam, the money, the shame. I wrote until my hand ached. And when I was finished, I closed the notebook and set it aside. I didn't feel better, but I felt something. Acknowledgement, maybe. Acceptance. I wasn't the first man to fall for a lie, and I wouldn't be the last. I thought about Maria sometimes. I wondered if she ever thought about me, if she felt any guilt, if she ever wondered what happened to this 67-year-old man she'd left with nothing. Probably not. I was just another Mark, another foreigner with money and a broken heart. Easy prey. But even knowing that, I couldn't bring myself to hate her. Maybe that made me weak. Or maybe it just made me tired. Too tired to carry anger on top of everything else. Winter came. Manchester rain turned to sleet. The hardware store was busy with people buying heaters and weatherproofing supplies. I worked my shifts, came home, ate simple dinners alone. Emily called me every few days. "How are you doing, Dad?" she'd ask. "I'm okay," I'd say. And some days, it was even true. One evening, I sat by the window in my flat, watching the rain streak down the glass. I thought about the cafe in Makati where I'd first met Maria, the way she'd laughed at my jokes, the way she'd made me feel seen. It had felt real. For those few months, it had felt so real. But it wasn't. It never was. And the sooner I accepted that, the sooner I could move on. I opened the notebook again and wrote one final entry. I'm 67 years old. I lost everything, my savings, my dreams, my trust. But I'm still here. I'm still breathing. I'm still getting up every morning and putting one foot in front of the other. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that has to be enough. I closed the notebook and set it on the shelf. Then I turned off the light and went to bed. Outside, the rain kept falling. And somewhere far away, in a country I'd never return to, Maria was living her life, spending my money, building her dreams. Maybe she thought about me sometimes. Maybe she didn't. It didn't matter anymore. I was home, and I was still here, and that somehow was enough.